So, continuing with our genetic studies, let's talk specifically about Gregor Mendel. He was the guy that discovered genetics. So in the 1800s, he was a priest living in a monastery, and he took care of the garden and grew pea plants. One day he started to notice that some of the plants had different traits. They didn't all look exactly the same. They were different heights, they were different colors, so we started to look into this. These are some of the different traits that Mendel started noticing. So things like the shape of the pod of the pea plant, the seed color, the flower color, the length of the stem, all those different types of things. And he started to wonder why that was. So he observed that those traits were often similar to those of their parents, but sometimes they had different traits than their parents. So if you think about certain traits you have that are similar to your biological parents, or ones that you have that are different from your biological parents, usually you end up with a mix of the two. So Mendel was studying pea plants, which was a good thing because they only have two forms of every trait. So as far as height, they're either tall or short. There is no medium-sized pea plant. In his first experiment, he crossed some tall pea plants with some short pea plants. So what do you think he got? All of the offspring were actually tall. So it seemed like that shortness trait had disappeared, and that was his first generation of plants. So you've got tall parent crossed with a short parent, all tall offspring in generation 1. Then he continued in his next experiment. He took 2 tall generation plants from his first experiment and he crossed them. So what did he get? He got some tall and some short. So that shortness trait had reappeared. So he's got tall from generation 1 crossed with tall from generation 1, and he got some tall and some short in that second generation of plants. So how did this happen? He figured out that the factors that control each trait exist in pairs. So the female parent contributes one trait while the male parent contributes the other. And one of those factors can kind of hide the other. For example, if your mom has brown eyes and your dad has blue eyes and you have brown eyes, the blue gene from your dad is actually hidden inside of your DNA. So it's there, it's just not expressed. An allele is a different form of each of those genes. So you get one allele from the biological mother and one allele from your biological father. And now in Mendel's pea plants, each pea plant inherits an allele for height. So they will either inherit 2 tall, 2 short, or 1 tall and 1 short. So what that plant will end up looking like depends on the alleles it gets. Some of the alleles are what we call dominant and others are recessive. And this is true of every trait that is inside of you and your DNA. So a dominant allele is a trait that always shows up in the offspring. That's the one that kind of covers up the other traits. So if you think about the word dominant, it's going to kind of dominate the allele there and it's going to cover up the other. These are represented by capital letters. For example, capital T equals tall. This is what we use to represent the alleles. On the other hand, a recessive allele is the trait that's masked or covered up if that dominant allele is present. So the only time that you see the recessive alleles show up is if you have 2 recessive alleles for that trait. And recessive alleles are represented by lowercase letters. For example, lowercase t equals short. So the letter is the same one as the dominant trait, but it's the lowercase version of it. So that letter, when you set up your Punnett squares later on, comes from the dominant trait. So for example, T for tall, lowercase t for short. So if a plant has 2 dominant alleles, we will write that in letters as 2 capital T's. And then a plant that has capital T would be tall. If a plant has 2 recessive alleles, one would write that as a lowercase t, and that plant would be short. Now, if you have 2 of the same alleles, that's known as being homozygous for a trait. So the stem homo equals same. That means you either have capital T, or lowercase t. Those 2 letters are exactly the same. If a plant has 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele, we will write that as a capital T, lowercase t. And that plant would end up being tall. Why? Because the dominant allele is going to hide the recessive allele. So you can think of it as if the big letter comes out to play, the little letter runs and hides away. Now, if you are capital T, lowercase t for a trait, that means you have 2 different alleles, 1 dominant, 1 recessive. So that's known as heterozygous. So hetero equals different, and heterozygous you would have a dominant and recessive allele. Those are 2 different things. Genes can also be expressed in 2 different forms. So when we look at those letters, we call them either the genotype, which is the genetic makeup of an organism. So for example, that would be your capital T. The phenotype is the physical expression of the genes. This is the part that you see. So if you were a big T, the phenotype that you would see would be a tall plant.